Since the dawn of life, extinction has been the one rule no species can outrun. In fact, it's estimated that over 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are now gone. From microscopic trilobites to towering dinosaurs, extinction is a relentless certainty, the ultimate end to every evolutionary story. And while this cold fact is accepted by science, it never fails to sting when that final moment arrives, especially when the species in question lived alongside us. What makes extinction even more haunting is how little we tend to notice when it happens. More often than not, we don't even realize we're seeing a creature for the very last time. A photo is taken, a casual sighting logged, and then silence. We often speak of the last photograph or the last video of an animal as if it were a memorial. But these rarely mark the actual final moment the species was seen alive. In many cases, animals went on living for years after their final public appearance, quietly surviving in some forgotten corner of the world, until the last one vanished, sometimes in plain sight, sometimes without a trace. It's those final sightings, the true last moments a human ever laid eyes on a creature, that carry a haunting weight. Because that wasn't just a picture, it was the end of a legacy, the last flicker of a once thriving species, passing unnoticed by most of the world. In the low-lying, swampy plains of central Thailand, there once lived a deer so elegant and striking that locals considered it almost mythical. Known as Schomburgk's deer, it wasn't just any forest dweller. With a dark pelt, a pale underside, and a majestic set of basket-like antlers, it was often called the most graceful of all Thai deer. Its antlers were the crown jewel of its appearance, broad, multi-branched, and sometimes sporting up to 16 points on each side. Foreign naturalists, who first observed it in the 1800s, were mesmerized by its beauty, describing it as a living sculpture, something more fitting for a royal painting than a muddy field. Historically, Thai people had coexisted with this species for thousands of years. It had been hunted, yes, but never excessively. Most hunting took place during the wet season, when floods would strand groups of deer on higher ground, making them temporarily vulnerable. But the population always bounced back. The deer had space, food, and time, until the modern world arrived. In the late 19th century, Thailand underwent a rapid push toward industrial agriculture, particularly rice production. Vast stretches of natural wetland were transformed into paddy fields, draining the habitat that Schomburgk's deer depended on. The already narrow range of the species shrank even further, forcing the deer to move into closer contact with human settlements. That contact proved fatal. As their habitat disappeared, these deer found themselves grazing on farmland and wandering into villages, easy targets for increasingly well-armed hunters. Poaching soared, and the remaining populations collapsed almost overnight. Within just a few decades, they were all but gone. The last known herd was spotted in the early 1930s, barely hanging on. Then, in 1932, a lone male was killed by a hunter, the last confirmed successful hunt of the species. But one more deer still lived. That individual, a solitary male, began appearing regularly around a temple in Samut Sakhon, not far from Bangkok. Locals described it as gentle and incredibly friendly, and soon the temple began to unofficially adopt the animal. Monks and visitors often fed it, and stories spread about its calm, almost spiritual presence. In a country where Buddhism and nature are deeply entwined, this quiet companionship was seen as a peaceful ending, a rare moment of coexistence between humanity and a species teetering on the edge. But that peace would not last. In 1938, tragedy struck in a moment of pointless violence. One night, a drunken man stumbled into the temple grounds and found the deer resting near a structure. For reasons never fully explained, he proceeded to beat the animal savagely, then stabbed it to death with a large blade. To this day, no one knows exactly why. Some have suggested he mistook the deer for a wild animal, or had been driven by some delusion. Others think it was simply drunken aggression, a terrible act of cruelty without meaning. Whatever the reason, it marked the end of Schomburgk's deer. That single, senseless attack became the final moment in the species' history. The last individual, not in the wilderness, not in hiding, but in the care of monks, was killed by a man who likely didn't even remember doing it. And that's what makes this extinction story so uniquely heartbreaking. It wasn't a slow fade into obscurity or a mystery sighting left unresolved. It ended with violence, confusion, and a complete lack of awareness. The deer didn't die from disease, climate, or evolution. It died at the hands of a random drunk, alone and unprovoked, in a place where it had once found peace. Today, only a handful of mounted specimens and faded photos remain. Some of its DNA has been preserved, but resurrection is unlikely. For all intents and purposes, Schomburgk's deer is gone forever. The Falkland Island wolf, sometimes called the wara, was a creature of paradox. It was the only native land mammal of the remote Falkland Islands. A predator that existed without prey, a wolf without a pack, and most tragically, an animal whose friendliness became its downfall. It was first recorded in 1690 by British Captain John Strong, who described the island's strange, fox-like animals as unusually large. Some said twice the size of English foxes, with long fangs and thick coats. They showed no fear of humans. In fact, one juvenile was brought aboard a ship and taken toward England. It reportedly bonded with the sailors, until a sea battle erupted with a French vessel. The deafening cannon fire sent the young wolf into a panic, and it leapt overboard, vanishing into the sea. Encounters like this became increasingly common throughout the 1700s. But what puzzled voyagers the most was its identity. Was it a wolf? A fox? Something in between? Regardless of the label, everyone agreed on one thing. The Falkland wolf was large, sharp-toothed, and fearless. Some likened its build to a mastiff, noting that its fangs were longer and more pronounced than even those of mainland wolves. At first, that bravery was admired. But as settlers arrived, fear replaced fascination. When the first European settlement was established in 1764, the wolves' behavior didn't change. They'd walk up to camps, sniff tents, and even accept meat from human hands. But the settlers saw this not as curiosity, but as threatening behavior. Many believed the wolves were aggressive and that they were killing livestock. In reality, these fears were unfounded. The sheep were reacting to the wolves' howls by running off cliffs or through fences, not being hunted. But by then, it was too late. Colonists began to poison the wolves. When that didn't work fast enough, they turned to fire. Historical records describe vast blazes lit across both East and West Falkland, aimed at flushing out and killing as many wolves as possible. One account described the scene as flames as far as the eye could see, with wolves desperately fleeing, often unsuccessfully, from the infernos. Despite all this, the Falkland wolf remained trusting of humans. They'd approach without fear, often walking into tents or calmly sniffing around campfires. Tragically, this made them even easier to kill. Some settlers even developed a cruel trick. They'd hold meat in one hand and a knife in the other, stabbing the wolf once it got close enough to take the offering. Over time, the population crashed. The wolf became rare, especially in the East. In 1834, during his famous voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, Charles Darwin visited the islands and noted the wolf's rapidly shrinking numbers. He predicted that extinction was not just possible, it was inevitable. In his own words, "Their numbers will soon be reduced to a minimum, and I believe that they will become extinct." He was right. By the 1870s, sightings had become exceptionally rare. And then came the final moment. In 1876, a lone Falkland wolf was spotted wandering the shallow bay of West Falkland. A hunter, likely unaware that he was witnessing the last of its kind, watched as the wolf approached. Not snarling, not lunging, but gently walking up with open curiosity. And just like that, he shot it dead. That silent, trusting act would be the last recorded interaction between a human and this native predator. Its extinction left scientists baffled for decades. How did a canid get to such a remote island? The waters surrounding the Falklands are deep and treacherous. Eventually, modern DNA analysis revealed that the Falkland wolf belonged to a now extinct genus of South American canids called Dusicyon, and its closest living relative, Ed wolf, a lanky, fox-like creature from South America. Theories about how the wolf reached the islands have since evolved. The most widely accepted explanation involves the last glacial maximum, when sea levels dropped and a narrow, icy strait may have formed, allowing animals to cross on foot. Others speculate that ancient humans brought them as companions, but there's no archaeological evidence to support that. Whatever the origin, one thing is tragically clear. The Falkland wolf's friendliness, not its ferocity, was its greatest weakness. It lived without natural predators, adapted to a peaceful life, and never learned to fear the one creature that would ultimately wipe it out. Among Africa's vast, iconic wildlife, there once lived a zebra that didn't quite look like a zebra. Known as the quagga, it was a strange hybrid of sorts, front half striped like its zebra cousins, rear half brown like a horse. For years, scientists thought it was a completely separate species, and honestly, who could blame them? The quagga's appearance was so bizarre, so halfway between horse and zebra, that it almost seemed like a trick of nature. But modern genetics would later reveal that the quagga was not its own species at all, but a subspecies of the plain zebra, one that had diverged around 200,000 years ago. Over time, it developed its unique coloring, a sparse pattern of white and brown stripes on the front, fading into a solid brown back half. This gave the quagga a ghost-like presence, as if nature had hit pause while designing its coat. It wasn't just their looks that made them stand out. Unlike other zebras, quagga mares were larger than stallions. with some females reaching up to 4 feet 5 inches at the shoulder. They were also the southernmost dwelling zebras in Africa, confined mostly to the Karoo region of South Africa, where they roamed in herds of 30 to 50 individuals. The indigenous San people knew of the quagga, depicting it in their cave art, but their relationship with it was distant. It wasn't until the Dutch settlers arrived that the quagga's fate would be sealed. Seen as easy targets for meat, quaggas were hunted relentlessly. Their docile temperament only made it worse. They weren't just killed, though. They were put to use. Quaggas were captured and kept near livestock to ward off predators. Farmers noted that they were far more likely to charge a threat than sheep or goats. Some were also sent to zoos, and researchers even attempted to domesticate them, believing the quagga was the most trainable of all zebras. But as with so many things, these experiments led nowhere. What followed was neglect. Despite being so heavily used, no protection was ever granted to the species, and that would prove fatal. Unlike other zebra subspecies that ranged widely across the continent, the quagga was confined to a very limited range. This made it extremely vulnerable to drought, hunting, and habitat loss. By the 1850s, wild quaggas had become a rare sight. Still, no laws were made, no restrictions on hunting, no reserves. And so, in the 1870s, just one wild herd remained, a sickly group in the Orange Free State. Researchers at the time reported that the animals were thin, unhealthy, and dwindling. And then, in 1877, drought struck. By the end of it, only one quagga remained. That final individual was reportedly feeble and underweight. In 1878, a group of hunters came across it. Not knowing what they were about to do, they shot and killed the last wild quagga. But no one realized it at the time. Quaggas still lived in zoos. They weren't officially considered extinct. The last captive quagga, a mare, lived out her days in the Amsterdam Zoo, where she died in 1883. Mysteriously, the exact cause of death remains unknown. Her body was not preserved. No one knew she was the last, and yet some believe the quagga may have held on a little longer, in secret. In one of his lesser-known travel books, famed Italian explorer Attilio Gatti described a moment in the 1930s that still sparks debate. Known for his credibility and unmatched knowledge of African fauna, Gatti had photographed over 53,000 animals, many of them extremely rare. He had been among the first to document species like the okapi and the bongo, so when he said he saw a quagga, people listened. In his book Here is the Veld, Gatti described coming across a solitary zebra in the wilderness. But it didn't look like any zebra he'd ever seen. It had stripes only on the front, fading into a brown rear, unmistakably a quagga. According to him, it lived alone for several years before finally disappearing without a trace. If true, Gatti's account would mean that a lone quagga survived nearly 50 years after its species was declared extinct. A single, forgotten soul wandering the veld. No herd, no mate, no purpose, just surviving. No photographs were taken, no DNA samples recovered. Many dismissed the story. But Gatti never backed down, insisting until his death that he had indeed seen a quagga. Whether it was real or mistaken identity, the possibility lingers. A lone animal, unaware of its role in history, trudging across a land it once ruled, the last of its kind. Once gliding through the warm waters of Florida and the Caribbean monk seal was a gentle giant of the tropics. It wasn't just any seal. It was the only species of seal native to the region, a creature so distinct that even its first human encounters were wrapped in fascination. With a robust frame stretching up to 8 feet long and a weight of around 270 kilograms, it was a powerful yet calm presence in the sea. And crucially, it had no natural fear of humans. Its history with people began as far back as 1494, when Christopher Columbus set sail on his second voyage. Among the many islands his expedition explored, one stood out for a different reason. Its shores were lined with what the sailors described as strangely calm, curious creatures. These were the monk seals. The records note that they didn't run, didn't bite, didn't even flinch. Instead, they waddled up to the men with childlike curiosity. That innocence would cost them dearly. Before departing, the crew killed 8 seals, simply because they could. That violent encounter would set the tone for centuries to come. Over time, the Caribbean monk seal became a target of exploitation. During the 1400s and 1500s, they were hunted at a slow but steady rate. But things worsened dramatically in the late 1600s, when sugar plantations began to rise across the Caribbean. These required machinery to be constantly lubricated, and that meant oil. Seal blubber became a valuable resource, and hundreds of seals were killed daily to keep the industry running. As commercial hunting raged into the 1800s, even fishermen joined in, pushing populations to the brink. By the mid-1800s, Caribbean monk seals were so rare that killing them was no longer profitable, but the damage was already done. Despite the massive decline, seals continued to be killed or captured, often for research or to be displayed in zoos. And it was in one of these zoos that the last known photograph of the Caribbean monk seal was taken, likely sometime in the early 1910s. The photo shows a calm, almost tired animal. The image would become iconic, but it did not capture the full story, because the seals weren't extinct, not yet. Well into the 20th century, reports trickled in from sailors and naturalists who still claimed to see them. Most of these sightings were vague, unverified, but in 1952, something different happened. The director of the Institute of Jamaica reported a confirmed sighting of a small colony, no more than 60 individuals, living around Serenilla Bank, a remote reef in the Western Caribbean. Even more surprising, the seals appeared to be in good health, undisturbed by human presence. It was a brief flicker of hope, but it would also be the last. After that, no confirmed sightings ever occurred again. Rumors persisted. A sailor here, a local there, all claiming to have seen something out in the water. But no photo, no capture, no follow-up ever confirmed another seal. In 2008, after a comprehensive multi-year search by the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service yielded no results, the Caribbean monk seal was officially declared extinct. It had likely been gone for decades. Its final breath may have come in the late 1950s, or even the 1960s, far from any camera or audience. One can only imagine a small group floating in the shallows of Serenilla, unaware they were the last of their kind, until one by one they disappeared. The tragedy of the Caribbean monk seal isn't just about extinction, it's about how being trusting, slow-moving, and unafraid of people made them easy targets. In many ways, their very nature, calm, gentle, curious, was weaponized against them. They weren't aggressive, they didn't flee, and that cost them everything. Their last confirmed moment, a lonely government report in 1952, now reads more like an obituary than a rediscovery. A final, quiet gasp before they vanished forever beneath the waves. Extinction isn't just a scientific concept or a statistic. It is a story made of moments. Moments when the last individual of a species breathes, wanders, or looks upon the world for the final time. These moments are often unseen, unrecorded, and deeply somber. From the silent seas where the Caribbean monk seal vanished, to the windswept Falkland Islands that lost their only native mammal, to the fading stripes of the quagga roaming South Africa alone, and finally to the graceful Schomburgk's deer, whose last moments were marked by tragic cruelty. Every story carries a weight of loss and a lesson. What these animals share is not just extinction, but the profound human role in their demise. Whether through ignorance, exploitation, or sometimes sheer cruelty, we were often the architects of their endings, yet their stories also remind us of the fragility of life, the dangers of misunderstanding, and the pressing need for conservation and respect. Remembering the last sighting, the last photograph, or the last tale is about more than nostalgia. It's about honoring a species' legacy, a way to keep their memory alive and learn from their fate. It challenges us to ask, what will we do to prevent other species from walking that final, lonely path? Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more amazing stories about extinct animals and the mysteries of our natural world.